This video is going to show you how you can set up a Drupal VM and Acquia BLT project in Windows 7 or Windows 8. In this example, I'm using Windows 7 64-bit Professional on a IBM ThinkCentre PC, and it has an Intel Core i5 processor. There's a few caveats to doing this kind of thing. It's 2017, and Windows 7 is getting to be a pretty old operating system. It still has some support from Microsoft, but the support is going to very mediocre / long-term security update only support soon. So you should make a plan to at least get to Windows 8, if not Windows 10 or some other operating system as soon as possible. Also, Acquia's BLT doesn't officially support Windows 7, so you're going to run into some issues and problems, and you won't be able to get any official support for BLT. Drupal VM marginally supports Windows 7, but highly recommends Windows 8 or 10 due to some path issues and other things like that. But in general, you can get things working. You just have to follow a very specific workflow. This is my Acquia test website. It's at acquia.jeffgeerling.com. And if I log into Acquia Cloud, you can see that this is my site, the application for it, and I have a dev stage and production environment. And the project is using BLT to build everything. So this video is going to show you how I can take this project and run it locally using the source repository, which I have on GitHub. It's called EEJGeerling. And I'm going to download the project, build a virtual machine locally, and be able to run it within Windows 7. To do this, there's a few extra things that you'll need to do to get your Windows 7 computer ready. One thing is you'll need to download and install some software. So the things that you'll need to download are Commander, which is a command line utility that makes it somewhat easier to do things like SSH and some of the other things that you need to do in a more Linux-like environment. I'm using Notepad++, but you can use whatever kind of IDE or editor that you need. The reason I use this is because it has easy support for Unix-style line endings. If you use Notepad or another Windows-based editor, you need to make sure that it supports Unix line endings, otherwise you'll have some issues. You also need to install Vagrant, the latest version of it, and VirtualBox, the latest version, so that you can run Drupal VM. And you need PHP installed, and there's a lot of different ways you can do that. One of the easiest and quickest is to download XAMPP, Z-X-A-M-P-P, and just install PHP and Apache with it. The final thing is you need to upgrade PowerShell, because Vagrant, the utility that builds the Drupal VM, Vagrant requires a newer version of PowerShell than shipped with Windows 7. If you have Windows 8 or 10, this might not be a big issue, but you'll need to download this installer. And there's links in the guide that I have linked from this video's description with links to download all of these different things. But here's everything that you'll need to download and install. The one thing that isn't a normal kind of install is Commander. You extract the zip file after you download it, and then the application is actually right here in the zip file. You can put this wherever you want. In my case, I just left it in my downloads folder, and then I created a desktop shortcut, which is right here. Another thing that you'll need to have is make sure that you have administrator access, so your account needs to be an administrator account, because when you run Commander, you'll need to run it as an administrator so that you have the right permissions level. Otherwise, some things like symbolic links don't work correctly. So finally, after you get all that stuff installed, after you upgrade PowerShell, you'll want to check and make sure everything's running okay. So I'm going to open up PowerShell and make sure that I'm on the right version, and I can do that by running, let's see what that command is. I can run ps version table.ps version to check, and it says I'm on version 4, so that's good. I also installed XAMPP, and when I installed it I made sure to only install Apache, PHP, and fake sendmail. You don't need to install MySQL or any of the other software it comes with. That just takes longer to install. And if you don't need it, don't install it. But it installs XAMPP into the XAMPP directory on your C drive. So here it is. And inside here, it has PHP, and there's a PHP executable right here. So to run that in PowerShell or in a command line environment, you'd say c:/XAMPP/PHP php.exe, and then I'm going to check the version. So this looks like it's working. It's saying it's PHP 5.6. You need to download the right version for whatever your Acquia cloud environment is, whether it's 5.6 or 7.0, 7.1. In my case, 5.6 should work fine. And this is not going to be the PHP version you're going to run your site in. This is just used for downloading all the Composer dependencies. So the next step is you need to set up Commander so that you can work with Drupal VM and with BLT. And it's important that you run Commander with administrator access. So right-click on it and say Run as Administrator. Or once it's open, you can also right-click on the icon or right-click somewhere and also open a new administrator version of it. So it opens you up into your home folder. So that opens you up into C, Users, and then your home folder. So it opens you up here, and if I ls, it shows all that information. And actually, this file shouldn't be here. I had that from an earlier test session. So it has all this stuff in here. And the next step is you need to make sure that PHP can be accessed by just running PHP. Otherwise, Composer won't work correctly and some other things. So if I run php-v, it actually still has that alias set up from when I was doing it earlier. But if you need to set up an alias to make sure PHP works just like that, you can say alias equals, alias PHP equals c:/samp/php php.exe, and then you need to pass in any arguments to it. So you do a $sign and asterisk, hit enter, and now PHP should work just like it did up above. So now you have the PHP alias working. You can also use Siegewin, or however you pronounce it, but in my case, Commander was working a little bit better. It also passes through command line arguments through to Vagrant a little nicer, so things work better if you're doing a more customized setup and you're using a different kind of share, things like that. The next step is you need to configure Git, and Commander comes with Git for Windows installed inside of it already. So if I say Git, it shows me that Git is installed, and I need to set some global configuration so that Git knows who I am. So I'm going to say git config global user.name Jeff Geerling, that's me. Git config global user.email geerlingguy@mac.com, that's me. And finally, there's another setting that you need to set to make sure that your Git commits from within Windows have the correct line endings, and that is git config global core.auto crlf true. And you can read more about that online, what that exactly does. But basically, it makes it so that when you're working within Windows and Git, it doesn't screw up line endings in files that you're changing. The next step is you need to install Composer so that you can use Composer to download all the project dependencies. So we're going to follow the guide that's actually in Composer's documentation. Composer download. Go to this documentation page. And this just uses PHP to download a file. Paste that in. It's going to download that, and then it has a command to verify that the file is the correct file and not something that somebody man in the middle hacked you with. So we're going to run that verification, and it says that the installer is verified. And then we set up Composer using this command. And it's going to download a few things, get the composer.far file. Far is for PHP archive. It's basically like a little self-contained PHP application. And then we're going to delete that setup file. So now I can test that PHP Composer is working. So I'm going to say php composer.far, and it shows me a list of all the commands I can run. So it definitely is working, and now I'm ready to start doing the rest of my setup. For any projects where you're going to use GitHub and where you're going to use Acquia Cloud with BLT, you need to be able to communicate with GitHub and Acquia Cloud securely, and the way that we do that is using SSH keys, or you might call them RSA keys or IDs. The way to set that up is to use a utility called SSH Key Gen. If you don't already have a key installed or set up, you can use SSH Key Gen to build yourself a key, and it's pretty simple the way that it works. You say SSH Key Gen -t RSA -B 4096. This is saying use 4096 bytes of entropy to build the key, so it's a little bit more secure than the default. And then -C, give it your email address as an identifier. And once you've done that, it will generate a key pair for you, and it'll ask you where you want to store it by default. And I'm going to store it in the default location for a new key. Depending on the speed of your computer, this can take a little time. Hit OK, and I'm going to overwrite this key. Enter a passphrase. In this case, we don't want to use a passphrase. There are ways you can do it with or without a passphrase. In this case, for demonstration purposes, I'll just use no passphrase. And now if I go into the .ssh folder in my home directory, I have an ID RSA key and an ID RSA.pub key. This key is private. You should never share this with anybody. You should never print it to the terminal or anything like that. It should only be on your computer, and unless you're doing something more exotic, just leave it where it is and don't ever open it. This key, the .pub key, is a public key, and that can be shared with anybody. In fact, on GitHub, if you go to anybody's username, so I'm going to go to github.com/geerlingguy, you can just add .keys to the end of their username, and it actually prints out all the keys they have in their account. These public keys are used along with the private key to make sure that the communication is secure and to verify the identity of the person using the key. So as long as you keep the private key private, you'll be okay. So at this point, I'm going to go back to my home directory, and then I'm going to copy out my public key. So I'm going to say cat.ssh/id rsa.pub. Don't ever print out your private key because you shouldn't need it. And now I have, this is the public key that I just created, and copied just from the M. So you copy from the SSH part all the way to the end of your email address. Oops, I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to right click. Select it and then edit, copy. And now I need to add the key to my GitHub and Acquia Cloud accounts. So I'm logged into GitHub already, so I can click on my profile and then click settings and then SSH keys. And then in this list I can add a new SSH key. You might not have any already, so I'm just going to add a new one here. I have some for my other computers that I use. And I'm going to say this is my Lenovo work Windows 7 test, because this computer I'm using is the Lenovo. And I'll paste in the key that I copied and add it, and it's going to ask me to confirm my password. And it will also email me telling me I added a new key, which is a good thing, because if somebody else added a key for me, then they could act like they were me, and that would not be a good thing. So now this key is here, and it's saying it's never been used because it's a brand new key. And I'm going to do the same thing within Acquia Cloud. I'm going to go to my profile, go to credentials, and then it's going to ask me for my password. Let me look that up. This one's a bit longer, so it'll take me a second to type it in. Okay, and here are my SSH keys, and I can add it in. I'm going to say work Win7 test, paste, add key. And now my key is also in my Acquia Cloud account. So that's all for the SSH keys right now. I'll come back to that in a little bit once we start connecting to things. But the next step will be getting the BLT project all set up. So I'm going to fork the project. If this were a project that I was working on with other people, there would be a canonical repository, and then everybody would have their own fork that they actually work in. So if I go geerlingguy, EEJ Geerling, I would create a fork. In my case, I already have a fork because this is my own. But I'd go to my fork, and then I'd click on clone or download and copy this URL. And then I can say git clone and then paste in the URL I copied, and it's going to clone into that repository. And if I look in here now, there should be an EEJ Geerling folder, and I'm going to go EEJ Geerling, and this is my project, which corresponds to all these files. And I can also access everything within Windows too, since this folder is going to be shared between the command line and Windows and eventually inside the virtual machine. So that's my project right there. And if this were a normal project, not one that I owned completely, I would also say git remote add upstream, and then I would add the canonical repository, whatever would be the main repository for it. I'd also add its URL here. That way I would be able to synchronize my repository with the canonical repository whenever I'm doing new work. But in this case, I don't need to do that. So the next step is to make sure that we have all the dependencies installed, because we're going to need to use Drupal VM, which is a dependency of this project. So I need to make sure I have Composer, and then I'm going to use Composer install to install everything. So first I'm going to move that Composer file we downloaded earlier. I'm going to move it from my home directory into composer.var in my project directory. Now if I list this, it shows it's right here. And then I'm going to run composer install, but there's a special thing I need to do. php composer.var install, and then because in Windows 7 there's a path length limit of 260 characters, I need to pass in an extra command, prefer source. And if I don't do that, then I'll get an error. So I do that, and it's going to use git clones instead of downloading tarballs. And it's a little bit slower to do this, but it makes it so that the Composer install will work within Windows 7. Windows 10 actually has support for longer paths, and I think Windows 8 might as well, but I know Windows 10 does. So I'm going to run that. It's actually going to take a little while, so I'm going to let it go. It's going to download all the dependencies of the project, including all the Drupal projects, all the modules, all the Drupal core and patches and things. During the process, there might also be some warnings about some patches not being able to apply. That's okay, because we're not actually going to use this Composer install instance for the site. We're going to do it again once I've jumped inside the virtual machine. So I'm going to fast forward this and let you not have to sit and watch the entire install process, because it takes a little while. And at the end, I'll go through what we need to do next. Another thing is, when you're running Composer commands, if it takes a really long time, like many minutes, 20, 30 minutes, sometimes the Composer command can time out because Composer has a built-in timeout in it. If that happens, just run the same command again, and it'll pick back up where it left off. Once this is finished, the next step is to move the Composer file back out of your project, because right now if I run git status, it'll show that I have this new file, and I don't want to commit that to my project. So I'm going to say move composer.var to composer.var one directory up, and now if I say git status, it shows me that there's no changes, and also the command line shows there's no changes in here. So the next step, now that we have the dependencies installed, including Drupal VM, we're going to build the virtual machine. So again, to reiterate, we needed to install Vagrant and VirtualBox, the latest versions of both of those. And Drupal VM will take care of the rest. It'll install all the dependencies like Node.JS if you're using it for your theme. It'll install Selenium for testing and all those kinds of things inside the virtual machine. So we have the project set up locally, and we're actually going to need to change a couple settings to make sure it works correctly in Windows 7. So I'm going to make a local configuration file. It's in the box directory, so the virtual machine configuration is stored in here, and BLT builds a config.yaml file by default. But I'm going to create a new file, touchbox/local.config.yaml, and that creates it in here. I'm going to open this with Notepad++. You can do it with Vim or whatever in your command line too, but in this case I'm just going to do it in here. Make sure your line endings are Unix line endings, and then I'm going to override a few variables. So Vagrant synced folder default type. Set that to an empty string. That'll tell it to use native VirtualBox shared folders. And then I'm also going to do Vagrant synced folders, and I'm going to override what BLT sets up and say local path is the current directory, destination is var www/project name, which in my case is eejgeerling, and type, I'm going to set that to a blank string. That means use VirtualBox native shared folders. And then I need to override post provision scripts to make sure that those aren't run on the first Vagrant up because of the way that Windows 7 handles the line endings. So I'm going to save that. And the reason I'm using VirtualBox native shared directories is because Windows 7 doesn't work correctly with the Samba version that's installed to do SMB. On Windows 10, I would say do SMB for native for faster Windows shared folders. On Windows 7, that's not a very good option. I haven't tried this on Windows 8, but there are some issues with symlinks and Samba shares in Windows 7. So native shares are the easiest to work with and the most flexible. But if you're doing something where you don't need to necessarily move the files back and forth as much, like using configuration management, you can actually use rsync as the shared folder type. And that's a heck of a lot faster, but it will require twice as much space on your hard drive, and B, it doesn't do two-way sync of files, so you'd have to manually copy files back. There are some other ways you can do this, but that's more esoteric and for a separate video or blog post someday. I already have some on my blog. If you go to jeffgeerling.com, you can find search for Vagrant Windows, and there's going to be a lot of blog posts about using SMB and rsync and NFS with WinNFS, other things like that. In our case, we're just going to use native shared folders. So I just make sure again that that line ending is Unix, which it is, and save the file. And I'm almost ready to run Vagrant up, but I want to make sure that I have a few of the plugins for Vagrant that make it easier to develop in Windows. So I'm going to say Vagrant plugin install, and there's a few that I almost always install on every computer, and it's Vagrant hosts updater. This one lets Vagrant manage the hosts file on your computer automatically, so you don't have to tweak it by hand just to load your site locally. Vagrant VB guest. This is helpful in case there's an update to VirtualBox or something like that. Sometimes the guest editions go out of date in the box that you use, and this will make sure they're always the right version for the right version of VirtualBox you're running. And then finally, Vagrant cashier. This actually won't help with the first time I build the VM, but in the future, if I need to rebuild the VM, it will have cached apt artifacts and composer artifacts, things like that, so that you don't have to re-download everything. If you have a slow internet connection, this is actually way more helpful, and it doesn't use too much disk space. So I'm going to install those, and I'll fast forward so that you don't have to sit and watch for the 2 or 3 minutes it takes. Now that that's finished, you can run Vagrant up. And that is a command that just brings up the virtual machine and runs its provisioner on the first time you run it. And this is going to take another 5 to 10 minutes. Could take even longer depending on how slow your internet connection is. But this does a lot of things automatically for you. It will download a minimal installation of, in this case, Ubuntu 14 LTS. But you can also change to use different base boxes. Use Debian or CentOS or whatever version that you want. It's going to download that, set up a virtual machine with that running inside of it, connect to it, mount a few network shares that you just configured in the config file, and then it will run an Ansible playbook, and it's going to install Ansible inside the virtual machine, and then it'll run the Ansible playbook to set everything up using Drupal VM. This is going to take a little while, so I'll fast forward through it, but if there's any issues, if you have a problem like Ansible outputs an error message or anything like that, you can usually just run Vagrant Provision again, and it will run through everything one more time and make sure it completes. You can also, if you run into some weird thing or you completely mess up your virtual machine, and this is one of the main reasons for automating all this, you can run Vagrant Destroy, and that will just blow out the entire thing, and then you can reinstall everything running Vagrant up again. If there's any problems where you can't get through it, or provisioning it once more, or rebuilding the VM doesn't work, you can always open up an issue on the Drupal VM issue queue. But I'm going to fast forward through this so you don't have to sit and wait while it installs everything. Once the VM is finished being built, you can log into it, but before we do that, we want to make sure that the SSH key that we set up earlier is the same key that we're going to use inside the VM. Otherwise, you'd have to copy it, and that kind of breaks our rule of copying around that private key. So there's a nice feature of Commander that it also includes the SSH agent utility that lets you load a key into memory, and then you can use that key inside the VM as well. So to use that, you just run start SSH agent, and it'll automatically pick up that RSA key that we created earlier. And now it's loaded in memory so that when I can run Vagrant SSH and log into the virtual machine, it actually lets me use that same key as if I were back on my host computer. So now I'm logged into the VM, and the VM we configured earlier to have the project directory local path up here shared into this folder. So I'm going to go there, cd var/www/eejgeerling, and if I look in here, this has all the files. So right now I'm inside the VM over here, and if I go back to my project and I touch a file, touch test.txt, I should see that that file pops up in here. And if I look in here, I see it here. And if I delete it in Windows, it will be deleted inside the VM because this folder is being shared. So you can see that file is gone. So the next thing that we need to do to prepare everything is make sure we delete all the stuff we just spent a little time installing with Composer, because from here on out we're going to do all of our project work inside the VM since it's easier and everything works correctly with BLT and Linux. So the things that we need to delete before we run Composer install are basically all the things that Composer had downloaded. So I'm going to delete the vendor directory, and I'm going to delete let's see, the doc root. Let me make sure that I get all of these. Doc root /core. I'm going to delete all the things inside of here. Delete. Actually, I need to delete the entire core directory. So delete that. I will also delete the libraries directory if there is one. In this case, I don't have any libraries for this site. And then I'm going to delete the contributed modules, themes, and profiles. So I'll go in here, contrib, and I need to delete all of these. Delete, yes. And then I need to delete all of the contrib themes. Delete, yes. Because the problem is if I don't delete these, then Composer gets a little confused since they were downloaded earlier using Windows. And then I'm also going to delete contrib profiles. And Composer is going to reinstall all of these things that I just deleted. So now I can run inside the virtual machine Composer install, and I don't have to use prefer source anymore because it can download the entire path correctly since we're inside the virtual machine where the file system can account for that. So I'm going to run Composer install, and while it's doing its thing, I will fast forward so you don't have to sit through that entire process again. Now that everything's installed again, but inside the virtual machine, we can run a command to set up the BLT alias correctly inside the virtual machine. We actually explicitly removed this when we set the post provision scripts to an empty array, just because they don't run correctly in Windows 7. So we're going to manually run that inside the VM by entering /vendor/ where is it? vendor/acquia /blt script Drupal VM, and then post provision.sh. And apparently that's denied. Oh, because pipelines was not installed. That's okay though. I'm going to see if I exit and then Vagrant SSH back in if the BLT command is available. So I'm logged back into the VM. I'm going to go to var/www/ what is it? eejgeerling. And then look in here and say BLT, and it looks like that might be working. Let's see, it should output a list of all the commands that I could run with BLT. That is if it's working correctly. It looks like it is. It's listing all the commands with that wonderful BLT header. It's a little bit slow though. Sometimes the working within the shared folder can be a little bit slow. Usually it's not this bad though. And then I can run a command to pull down the database from my staging server to my local computer. So I'm going to say BLT local refresh, And what that's going to do is pull down content from my stage server. Mine is called Acquia stage.jeffgeerling.com, and you can see it's the same thing as my production server. And if I go back to my Acquia Cloud dashboard, you can see that it's the stage environment right here. So it's going to pull the database down and then run a bunch of BLT commands and tasks to run database updates, install the latest configuration, and anything else I have it configured to do. The first time that you run this, it's actually going to connect to the Acquia Cloud server the first time. So when it does that, it's going to ask you to accept a host key. When that comes up, you need to type in yes, Y-E-S, to accept that host key. If you don't on the first time that it does it, it'll time out after a while, so I'll have to rerun the BLT local refresh command. So I'll wait for that to come up, and then I'll type in yes, and then let it continue pulling down the database and installing updates and doing all that kind of stuff. But I'll fast forward through the video so that you don't have to wait for that. Now that BLT is finished pulling everything down and getting it set up, I should be able to go to local.eejgeerling.com, which is the URL that I have set up in my project for my local environment. It'll take a few seconds because the first time it does this, it has to populate all of Drupal's caches. And once this loads, it should be the same site that's on my production, staging, and dev environment, which it is. And if I want to log into it, I can, inside of here, cd into the doc root, and then run drush URI equals http local.eejgeerling.com ULI. That'll give me a login link that I can copy and paste into my browser to log into the site. And this takes a little time because it's still building all the caches to get everything correctly. And once it loads, I can copy this URL, copy, paste it here, and it should log me into the site. And now that I'm logged in, I can do anything that I want. I can export configuration and store it in Git and push it up. So back here, since this is a full Git repository, I can say git status. I could create a new branch if I'm working on a new feature. Git checkout -b for a new branch, JJG 123. And then I can push that branch up, -u origin JJG 123. And before I push this, I'll show you. Right now I have a few branches on my GitHub repository, 21 and 15. If I push this one up, say yes, accept the host key on GitHub, it's using my Git key that I had set up, the SSH key I had set up earlier and put on GitHub. It uses it to push that branch up, and if I refresh this page on GitHub, you'll see that it has a new branch that I just pushed up. So that is how you get BLT running locally. When you're finished with your work, you can exit the VM and then Vagrant halt. And whenever you open up Commander again, so I'll let this shut down the VM. Once it's shut down, if I go back here, I'll let it shut down. If I go back to the site, then it's going to say that it can't load the page because the VM's not running. So if I'm coming back into Commander fresh again, run as administrator, and then cd into eejgeerling. Make sure you say start SSH agent every time you're going to load the virtual machine, and then you can say Vagrant up and then Vagrant SSH. Hopefully there was something helpful in there. This process that I went through took a long time to get it down to the point where everything just works. And if there's anything you can think of that can help make it a little faster or better, please let me know in comments on this video or on my blog post that's linked in the description below. Thanks. I apologize for the quality of the audio in that recording in the whole screencast. I was doing it on a relatively old Windows PC that only allowed me to plug in my USB headset, and that thing does not have a good microphone. But I wanted to spend a couple seconds thanking people who have supported me on Patreon, allowing me to have the equipment and time to be able to build these kinds of video tutorials. If you liked this tutorial, please give a thanks and shout out to Marco de Bortoli, Aaron Froelich, Oscar Schuldstrom, and anyone else who's given any support on Patreon. I'm sure I butchered some of those names, and I have so many friends on Twitter and YouTube and elsewhere that I usually know them by their screen name but not their actual name. But thank you to those guys, and if you'd like to support my YouTube channel and my blog posts and things like that, my open source work, please check out the link to my Patreon in the description below.